Hello everyone, this is Austin, and this is my first attempt at recording a tutorial for programming in Unity. So there's some things that I've done. I'm still a newbie, and undoubtedly there's better ways of doing certain things, so don't flame me too hard in the comments, but this tutorial is going to cover the inventory system that I've been working on. I'm working on a survival game, and I wanted the inventory to be somewhat advanced in what the player could do with it. For example, I look up to Satisfactory for some really great inventory functionality, or just take Minecraft. That's the best example there is for how many things you can do with your inventory in that game. This tutorial will be covering specifically, you'll be able to pick up items, see how much of the item is on the ground. Some of these have lower quantities. Pick up the wood, it'll appear here. You'll be able to move these items around. These will be armor slots, so only armor will be able to go into these slots. Also, these are your hand slots, which you could use the scroll wheel to change slots, or the number keys, or your num keys on the right side of your keyboard if you have those. Resources will not be able to be placed in those, or you could also drop items by bringing them here and they will appear on the ground. And then things like this, consumable, you could place in your hotbar, and if I left click, that'll do its primary use. Thank God that still works, because there's some scripts and all I've removed in order to focus solely on this tutorial. So left clicking out of the inventory will use those, and right clicking on an object from anywhere will also use that item. If I load up the inventory, get it as full as possible. There we go. Inventory was full. Check how much is on the ground here. There's 11 here. So if I try and pick this up, then there'll be 20 here, and the remainder will be on the ground. So they essentially just swap, because that's also something you can do if you're dealing with same materials that both have non-max stack. Oh no, okay, there's some scripts I've removed that have some of the things I've removed have made that stop working. So I won't be covering any of the survival elements that I've been working on for my game, or really go in depth for, say, power-ups, so applying effects of the consumables to the player, like consuming berries would give the player more hunger. Well, I was able to consume these, so if I go ahead and consume a couple of these and then try and combine them, well, it'll actually combine them instead of only swapping. Like I said, I wanted the inventory system to be a little more complex with what the player could do with it. So if you're looking for a simpler inventory system, then I will link a video from CodeMonkey in the description, and also try to the card in the top right, so you can go view that. That's basically just throwing items into an array or a list, whichever he used, and you were able to interact with the UI at the very least by using the item or throwing the whole stack out of your inventory. And also, I won't be going over the player controller too much, but if you're stuck on that, there's a really good video from Acacia developer. I'll link that in the description and make a card as well. And that'll cover everything you really need for setting up the player controller the way I have it in this project. I'm also going to create a new GitHub repository, so you can just grab all the scripts from there and you won't have to take the time to follow along with what I'm doing. Now, this won't be like your usual Unity tutorial where I code up everything as it's explained, because I've put about 87 hours into this project so far, and that it would take a while it'd be a lot of footage to go back and basically look at my other screen and retype everything out. I think for this I will just go step through code that I've written and kind of explain what's happening. Even if I did type it all up, then the footage would probably just be 2-3 times speed, and then you'd have to pause and whatever. Either way, let's just do it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the inventory script. This is the backbone of the player's inventory, of course. We're going to start by getting a reference to their inventory slots. If I check out the UI, the inventory slots would be these 12 slots. The inventory hand slots are these 4, and the inventory armor slots are these 3. For this though, I'm only getting a reference to the slots and the hand slots. We'll also need a reference to an empty inventory item, which you can go ahead and just make a prefab of, in items, and the empty inventory item. And this is simply the inventory item with there's no real item. Leave that at empty. We'll have a sprite, and those will stay at 0. So it's just, yeah, completely empty. This will allow us to initialize the player's inventory, so that when they first play the game, then they have a completely empty inventory and all the interactions happen properly. We'll also be saving a list of their inventory items. So this would start as nothing but empty inventory items, and same goes for their inventory hand and the armor list. All of these are going to be filled with those empty inventory items at the very start of the game. So we had the mono behavior, and this is where it will create the new list, make sure there's no null errors there, and we'll call the initialize inventory function all on awake. There's a lot of getters and setters in all of my scripts because I've kept all the variables protected or private. So in this case, we're getting the inventory slot count, getting the inventory hand slot count, getting the inventory item list, getting the inventory hand item list, and getting the inventory item armor list. To add items to the inventory, make this function here. It'll take in the inventory item that you'd want to add to the inventory. Make sure it's null, because if it is, then we won't do anything. And then we'll get the type of the inventory item. Actually, I should pull that up now. Go to the inventory item. For this script, originally it was saving a string that maybe a designer would save, and then, well, every time you wanted to compare items or their types, then you'd have to both have the string memorized, and I've always heard that string comparisons are not something you should do so often because they can be slow. I've gone with enumerators. That way you can just select what it is, and comparisons are very easy. So we got the items here. This is just what I have in my survival game so far. So you can really make this whatever you want. Just make sure you've got the none and the empty at the very least for that empty inventory item. And other variables, it stores the item and item type that has been selected, as well as an item sprite. So that way, if there is an inventory item at a certain slot, it will change from there being like no sprite to whatever sprite you've given it here, and that way the player can actually visually see what item they have in their inventory at that slot. This for same objects in the inventory, this is what's going to track how many of the same items are in the same slot. This will put a cap essentially on how many items can be in the same slot. So if you didn't have that, then I guess that would you could keep adding the same item to a slot infinitely, and the number just keeps getting higher until you hit the integer limit. And it's going to have some functions here, primary actions and secondary actions. This will be for cases when if you have a consumable or a weapon, which I'll get into a bit later, or might be in the second video. This will be what it's called when you would want to use the inventory item. So for instance, like left clicking it while the inventory is not open would call your primary action, and then you'd have to create some child classes that inherit from inventory item that implement more specific functionality for the primary and secondary action. Or you don't have to include the secondary action. It might only have the primary action, like the consumables, which would be eating the food or drinking water. You're going to have the function to pick up the item, which you'll pass in an inventory, so it actually knows which inventory to add itself to. Look at the get and sets. They're going to be everywhere. You have one to get an item, one to set an item, one to get the item type, one to set the item type, get the item count, set the item count, get the max stack size, and set max stack size. Max stack size. To get item sprite and set item sprite. So let me clear up what's happening in the inventory here, where I'm getting the incoming inventory item, Again, that was being called here, add to inventory. So it passes itself in, and then it gets the type of that item and checks if it's a resource or if it's a consumable, because those are going to be inventory items that can stack. That depends on what you want to do with it. Like I'd imagine some items like that would stack, but other items like your weapons and armor would not, especially if you want to implement durability, which I have not done yet. Check if the incoming item can be added to an existing stack. So essentially you're looping through the inventory, because the only place these incoming items will be added to is that big chunk of inventory, the 12 slots. Call it the core inventory, I guess. So it loops through that and it checks if there is an item in the slot which matches the incoming item. And if it does, then it'll get the max stack size of the item in the slot. It'll save get the current size of the stack size of the item in the slot. It'll add the stack size of the current item that is entering the inventory and calculate what the new stack size should be. And then if it turns out this slot that is being checked is at max capacity, then it'll skip over it, and of course it'll try a new slot that has the same item, if there is one. It'll check if the amount that the new stack size is going to be larger than what the stack size is meant to be. So it'll basically set the current stack size to the max stack size, and then whatever amount is remaining will either enter a new stack of the same item type if there is a slot with the same item type in the inventory, or it will later on give that remainder to a different loop, which will add the remainder to the first inventory slot that is empty. And in this case, the whole stack can fit in the slot, which just means whatever this new amount is, the inventory item in this slot can be set to that stack size. And this is where it will simply take in the inventory item and add it to the first empty inventory slot. There's also a different add to inventory. Object-oriented programming is amazing. It's the same function, but it'll just take in the game object. It'll get there should be a null check here for if it actually has the inventory item component, but it'll get the component off this incoming object and then add that to the inventory using the function above. Remove item from inventory is quite different, because this is the thing that I'm most unsure of. When I started doing it, the idea came to me and I thought, why not? It seems kind of stupid, but the whole point of this script, which is just an empty class, and this script, another empty class, was for identification. When this function is called, there's some booleans that get passed in that essentially, wherever this is being called from before then, it is checking if the inventory item has either of these components. There's certain cases where it will matter. There's other ways, of course, of doing this. You might throw another enumerator into inventory item and then clarify if it's in the core inventory or the hand slots or the armor slots. But in this case, I've just used an empty class. So it'll take in the index in the inventory that the item should be removed. And again, that the context of the index will change depending on if it's in the core inventory, it's a hand item, or an armor item, or I should say slot. Because if I pop back open the UI real quick, the index of 4 for the core inventory would be this slot. The index of 4 for the hand slot would be here, and the index of 4 for the armor just wouldn't even exist, so that would throw an error, and that's why the context for the index does matter. But of course, all of this information is like verified before this function is called, so that way an error is never thrown, like an out of index error. Just to be safe, there is an extra check in here. Make sure at least the index is not out of range for the core inventory, and then using these booleans, it'll get the item from that part of the inventory and just set it to an empty inventory item, because deleting the item is being handled somewhere else. So all this is doing is setting it to an empty inventory item. And the last thing is, here's the initialize inventory that I mentioned probably 30 minutes ago now. It'll clear both the lists And actually, one more thing that should be in here. Whoops. It'll clear all 3 of the lists, then go through and add the empty inventory item to however long the list is. There's also some functions like this one. It'll check if the inventory is full, something that helps determine if like the text that the player sees above their crosshair is that the inventory is full, so they can't pick anything up. Or this has same item of non-max stack size. This would essentially allow kind of a bypass of the is inventory full. If you had 4 berries in your inventory, but every other slot was filled and there were however many berries on the ground, you could still at least pick up berries, but not anything else if your inventory is at the max stack size. This inventory debug, not really debugging everything anymore. This was something I coded early for testing purposes, so it's a bit irrelevant. You won't have to include that one. Now we'll move on to the player inventory, which is where the inventory and the UI are combined. So start we get a reference to inventory UI. I'll get to that in a minute. Inventory slots, the items, item counters, hand slots, hand items, the hand item counters, armor slots, armor items, and armor item counters. It's getting every UI component that is going to require updating as the inventory changes. The inventory is broken apart where there's a slot. As you can see, there's still something in it there at the same location. The slot is what I'm using to make sure that the inventory items always snap back to the location they're supposed to be at in the inventory. This is essentially, the slot is purely for this nice looking background, which by the way, this is not actually custom texture. This is just something that comes with Unity and it's called background. Yeah, all that's really mattering for it is the transform and this index value, which is another script I'm using to help me identify where an item is in the player's inventory and make sure things will swap appropriately, and that when the inventory updates, it makes sure that all the items will go back to the place that matches up with the list of inventory items. So all that's happening with this is just the index value, get and set it. And again, there's probably a better way of doing this, there's no doubt. One last variable for the selected inventory hand slot, which you were able to swap by using the scroll bar or numbers. And all of those are being set from the inventory UI that you'd get a reference to in the inspector. So it gets all this stuff from inventory UI. Actually, I'll go ahead and just showcase this now. Inventory UI is lists of all the UI. Go back in here, the inventory UI, like here. There's a lot to drag in over here, and it's gonna be more of a pain the more inventory slots you have. So it's also tracking the counters, which is just the number here. It's a child object under the inventory items, the item count. So once you get a reference to all of that stuff, don't forget your inventory discard, just a bunch of more getters and setters for each of those objects that you are referencing. Back to the player inventory, in Awake, there's also a function called refresh inventory visuals that's being called. Get to that in a second. More getters and setters for the inventory UI, the selected inventory hand slot, and selected inventory hand slot. Here's the refresh inventory visuals. This will move the UI inventory items to the correct location, so it gets the transform of the inventory slot and then set the inventory items transform, of course at the same index, to where it should be visually in the inventory. And it'll do the same thing for the list of slots and items and the list of armor slots and items. It'll make sure that at that slot it has the correct sprite and text for the stack size, and also adjust the index value when things swap. It'll change the raw image color to be transparent if this was an empty item, and sets the texture to null, or else it'll just get whatever it finds and make it visible. And a little check for the item count is if there is only 1 or 0 items, then it'll set the text to nothing, or else it'll inform the player of the number of items in that stack. And the last thing it does is make sure the index value at the UI matches up with the index of the actual player's inventory. And then that basically repeats for both the hand items and slots and the armor items in slots. If we go into swap inventory items, well, this is called whenever the player adjusts the inventory through the UI. This was the part that I wasn't sure of when I was working on this, was how I could actually get the mouse to interact with the UI. And at first I thought the only option was like shooting a ray cast from the camera to the mouse's position, but it turns out there were some systems in Unity that kind of handled it all for you. And I will also link a video to CodeMonkey's tutorial on that. This will be called from scripts that I'll get to in the next part, but it'll take in the index of the two items it needs to swap. It'll find the items at that index and then just set one to the other, and then it'll make sure the inventory is refreshed after that. And there's some other special cases. These are the special cases I was talking about, where if it's not clarified that an item is in the hand slot or an armor slot, then things don't swap properly. If I tried swapping an item in the third position here to like the fourth position here, and I didn't clarify that it was, and I was putting the item in a hand slot, then it would really just transfer the inventory item from this third slot to this fourth slot. So there's specific function to be called when there's two inventory hand items being swapped. Inventory item being swapped with a hand slot. Inventory item in. If I was more specific with these names, then it would be more clear. But then they'd be so much longer than they already are. It swaps the item in an inventory slot with an item in a hand slot. It swaps an item in an armor slot with an item in an inventory slot. And in case I forgot what the index meant for the armor slots, because based on the way I have them set up, there should only ever be helmets in the first slot, chest plates in the second slot, and leggings in the third slot. And this one has a few more checks in it than the others, because you need to make sure that if I'm dragging an item from here to here and it's not a helmet, then I can't allow that. If I'm dragging the helmet to the inventory, but there's something else that's not a helmet in here, then I can't allow that. Essentially, you're trying to swap an empty inventory item with an empty inventory item, then nothing's going to happen. Because at one point, if there was a resource in this fourth slot and an empty in the third slot, and you drag the empty to the fourth slot, the player, you could still interact with the empty even though nothing visually seems to be happening. But if you did finish that action, then the item in the fourth slot would still enter or swap to the item in the third slot. And I didn't quite like that it did that, so I've only allowed the player to drag an item to a different slot if that item is not an empty item. And here is more checks. Make sure that armor matches the armor that the slot is meant to hold. There it will remove armor and place it in the empty slot, or remove the armor and adds a different type of armor. And I should probably clarify that this primary action will be whatever you want the armor to do, especially when the player equips it, and the secondary action is whatever you'd want the armor to do when the player takes it off. And again, refresh the inventory. Here's some functions for combining stacks. So it'll take in the inventory items that it wants to combine, as well as, again, the index of the items it's going to be combining. So make sure it is messing with the right inventory slots. And this is very similar to the calculation that's happening in the inventory when items are being added to it, not exceeding the max stack size, and combining everything into one stack. And we go to select hotbar slot. This is the functions that are being called when the player uses the mouse scroll wheel in order to change their slots. So this makes sure that it loops around. These checks make sure it loops around if the player continues, for instance, scroll down when they've already got the fourth slot selected. So then it'll select the first slot. I don't think I need to really go into detail on like placing things in the canvas. If you're watching a programming tutorial, you probably already know how to handle UI in Unity, like holding Control and Shift and clicking this to make sure the certain UI elements will or stretch to fit the entire canvas, things like that. Crosshair UI is just some sprites, nothing special. World Tip UI, that is being used when the player hovers their mouse over an inventory item so that they can see there's some text that'll appear above the mouse and they can see exactly what the item in their inventory is. Or sorry, that's the inventory tooltip UI. The world tooltip UI is the text that appears above the crosshair so the player knows the hell they're looking at. So that leaves the last script as the player controller, and there's a lot of stuff to this one. Specifically, you'll want to pass in the UI so that's going to be updated here in the player controller. And what else is there in here specifically for the inventory? There's the pickup range, pickup min drop distance, and max drop distance. Although currently I was having a hard time figuring out how to make for certain whether a position is a valid spawn point without getting some randomness in here and try spawning an object anywhere in a radius around the player and making sure that wasn't clipping into something. So I've still got some work to do on that, but for now you can at least make sure that if there are items in the scene and you try dropping something, then at the very least the objects won't place and clip into each other a bunch. It'll actually do that, and that won't look like a hideous mess. So that was kind of inspired from Satisfactory. The even hand slot select reverse. So I don't think I ever actually implemented this, but this was supposed to make it so instead of scrolling up to move left and scrolling down to move right on the selected hand slot, then it would do the opposite if this were set to true. That's also a nice feature that Satisfactory added. And all the keys for interacting inventory, making the inventory actually open and close, that's happening here in the player controller. The left click key to use items, and again that changes based on if the inventory is open or not. Num keys do the same thing as the scroll wheel. Get a reference to the inventory UI so that it can also do what it needs to with the UI elements. Is inventory active will save whether all the inventory UI is open or not. In mono behaviors, it's getting the inventory UI from the player inventory. A lot of these components are all on the same object, so the player controller can get the player inventory component and then get the inventory UI. And then this selected inventory hand slot gets the player inventory, gets the selected hand slot, and make sure that that slot, the background will appear so the player knows which slot they have selected. And an update, it's calling inventory interactions, only happen if the inventory is actually viewable. Hotbar interactions are essentially left or right clicking while the inventory is closed will then let you swing your axe, for instance. You wouldn't want the player to be able to do that while their inventory is open accidentally. And then it'll check for pickups in the scene where the player is looking and check other inputs. This will, if you use the inventory key, which I have set to tab, it'll toggle the inventory using the scroll wheel, changes the selected slot, or using the number keys, change the selected slot to whatever number was pressed. Change selected hand slot, it gets more specific with which slot was the one that was previously selected. Make the background of that one completely opaque so it can't be seen, and then whatever the new selected slot is, make that background viewable so the player knows which is the new slot that they've selected. Some functions that are doing the same thing, but just incrementing the slot change in a direction based on the scroll wheel input. The pickups and inventory are checked for pickups. This is how I thought I'd imagined I was going to have to do all the interactions with the UI, but I'm only had to do it to change the world UI text and let the player know what item that they were looking at. So it gets the cameras transform.forward. It does a bit shift of index layer 6, which I think that is where the player is. I've edit layers. Where did that go? Oh, right. This is a new project, so that might be why. But I imagine I would have set the layer to player. Yeah, so that way the ray cast will ignore the player. It shoots the ray in the direction of the camera. The pickup distance will be taken into account here. So if the hit is successful, then it'll continue past this. It'll see if it has the inventory item component. This check is kind of unnecessary, but if object the player controller is attached to also has the player inventory component, if neither of those are null, then we can continue, and it'll change the world UI text to reflect what the item is on the ground as well as its current stack size. Here's where the checks come into play for a full inventory. Player's inventory is maxed. We enter here, but at the same time we also check if they have any space for one specific item still in their inventory, which is the one that the player is currently looking at. And if that's not the case, then we tell them that their inventory is completely full, no way they can pick up this item. Then pressing E won't do anything because, well, it returns before we get there. Otherwise, it will let you pick up this item, but there's a special case for this. It'll transfer one's stack size to the other. Once again, similar calculation to how the inventory takes in items. The item in your inventory will have its stack size increased. The one in the world will have its stack size decreased. And if it can't transfer everything, it'll leave that item in the world instead of deleting it. Only if everything transfers does it destroy the game object in the world and then refresh the inventory. And then here is just, there's no problems with inventory fullness. Player just presses E and they pick up the item, it destroys it in the world, everything is right with the world. Here's the toggle inventory UI. I was frustrated that I had to resort to all these for each loops to make sure all of the right objects are set to active or not be active properly whenever the player hit tab. Originally still using a list, but in order to make sure the item that the player is dragging around with their mouse appears above everything else, I had to throw everything under the same parent object because UI works a bit differently when it comes to drawing one thing on top of the other, and the only way I could figure out how to make it pure right, that item had to essentially be dropped to the bottom in the hierarchy under this parent object, and it prevented me from shutting off the entire inventory UI at once. But like this, I could no longer do that because the hand slots, they had to be under the same parent object. So the inventory UI, it'll get the inventory item discard UI, because that's by itself, that's not in a list, and make that visible. And then it'll change the lock state and visibility of the cursor so that that's available again, and it'll make sure that the player can't move the camera while they're inventory, so they can move the mouse freely. The player can still move while the inventory is open though, so that's pretty nice. If the player closes the inventory, we're going to make sure the text that was above the player's cursor also goes away, or else if you close the inventory while your cursor is still above an item, then that text is going to stay there. It does the opposite of above, and then make sure the cursor disappears and the player can move their camera again. And the update inventory actions is a big one. It'll update the inventory tooltip and let the player use their items from their inventory. So it'll get the inventory item index from the mouse, inventory item index from their hand, and the inventory armor item, which is also related to the index. Set the text again to nothing. Here's another check. It just returns a -1 if anything were to go wrong in this function. Gets the player inventory, all the items that are in the player's inventory, and it checks if the player's cursor is hovering over an item that's in their core inventory, then it'll get the item from that index. Else if the player's cursor is hovering over like the hand slots or the armor slots, then it'll get the item from that index. And then it makes sure the text actually follows the player's cursor, and if it gets an empty item, then it's not going to tell the player that it's an empty item. We just want it to tell the player when it's anything else. And here's where the player might use consumables or whatever else you want in the inventory. They press right click and the item is actually a consumable, then we'll do its primary action. This will also return in case if you have some checks in with the consumables. For instance, if the player were at max health, then maybe you wouldn't actually want to use the consumable, then this would return false. And it also gets the item count, because if you use it, then you want the player to lose the item. So if it's less than 1, or if it's equal to 1, essentially, then instead of just reducing the item count, the stack size to 0, it will go ahead and remove that item from the inventory. Else it'll just reduce the stack size. Always refresh the inventory visuals, make sure things snap back into place. Update hotbar interactions only runs when inventory is not open, and it handles using items in those hand slots. So if you were to left click, get all the right things, get the indexes, the inventory item list, and items that are in the hand slots, then it'll call the inventory item's primary action. In the case it's a consumable, you have to pass in the power up manager. I'll get to that in part 2 of this. So if it was consumed, we don't want to do anything. Yeah, same thing that's happening above, just with, the slightly different controls. And to get the end item index from the mouse is being used above. Gets the data from the mouse position on the screen. It does the raycast, and if it encounters the UI, then it'll get the index of that object. Of course, it has to have the component. Yeah, and if it doesn't have that component, it returns -1. Is the inventory item index inventory hand slot? This will return if the UI the raycast collides with has the component is inventory hand item. This is where if you use an enumerator instead, then you would change it. This here is in the armor item. Doing the same thing, just checking for this component. And once more, got some getters and setters for the minimum and maximum drop distance. And this is already going to be extremely long, and we're only through half of it, so this isn't going to work completely. So you're just going to have to stay tuned for the second video. I'm going to have that out shortly. But thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this made any sense at all, because it probably didn't. I just hope you find the video helpful. That's all. All right, bye.